All books read aloud on Old Pagan books are in the public domain and are therefore copyright-free. This recording, however, is not in the public domain. Therefore, any unauthorized use is in violation of international copyright law. This channel covers pagan topics such as mythology, folklore, fairy tales, shamanism, occult, and the esoteric. Reading of a text does not imply that we endorse everything included therein. Thank you for listening. Your support of this channel is appreciated. Religion of the Ancient Celts by J.A. MacCulloch, published in 1911, chapters 1 through 3. The scientific study of ancient Celtic religion is a thing of recent growth. As a result of the paucity of materials for such a study, earlier writers indulged in the wildest speculative flights and connected the religion with the distant East, or saw in it the remains of a monotheistic faith, or a series of esoteric doctrines veiled under polytheistic cults. With the works of M. Gadoz, Bertrand, and Darbois de Jupenville in France, as well as by the publication of Irish texts by such scholars as Doctors Windisch and Stokes, a new era may be said to have dawned, and a flood of light was poured upon the scanty remains of Celtic religion. In this country, the place of honor among students of that religion belongs to Sir John Rhys, whose Hibbert Lectures on the Origin and Growth of Religion as Illustrated by Celtic Heathendom, 1886, was an epoch-making work. Every student of the subject since that time feels the immense debt which he owes to the indefatigable researchers and the brilliant suggestions of Sir John Rhys, and I would be ungrateful if I did not record my indebtedness to him. In his Hibbert Lectures, and in his later masterly work on the Arthurian legend, however, he took the standpoint of the mythological school, and tended to see in the old stories myths of the sun and dawn and the darkness, and in the divinities sun gods and dawn goddesses, and a host of dark personages of supernatural character. The present writer, studying the subject rather from an anthropological point of view, and in the light of modern folk survivals, has found himself in disagreement with Sir John Rhys on more than one occasion. But he is convinced that Sir John would be the last person to resent this, and that, in spite of his mythological interpretations, his Hibbert Lectures must remain as a source of inspiration to all Celtic students. More recently, the studies of M. Salomon Reinach and of M. Dottin, and the valuable little book on Celtic religion by Professor Andwell, have broken fresh ground. In this book, I have made use of all the available sources and have endeavored to study the subject from the comparative point of view and in the light of the anthropological method. I have also interpreted the earlier cults by means of recent folk survivals over the Celtic area wherever it seemed legitimate to do so. The results are summarized in the introductory chapter of the work, and students of religion, and especially of Celtic religion, must judge how far they form a true interpretation of the earlier faith of our Celtic forefathers, much of which resembles primitive religion and folk belief everywhere. Unfortunately, no Celt left an account of his own religion, and we are left to our own interpretations, more or less valid, of the existing materials, and to the light shed on them by the comparative study of religions. As this book was written during a long residence in the Isle of Skye, where the old language of the people still survives, and where the genus loci speaks everywhere of things remote and strange, it may have been easier to attempt to realize the ancient religion there than in a busier or more prosaic place. Yet, at every point, I have felt how much would have been gained could an old Celt or Druid have revisited his former haunts, and permitted me to question him on 100 matters which must remain obscure. But this, alas, might not be. I have to thank Miss Turner and Miss Annie Gilchrist for the valuable help rendered in the work of research, and the London Library for obtaining for me several works not already in its possession. Its stores are invaluable aid to all students working at a distance from libraries. J. A. MacCulloch. Chapter 1. Introductory. To summon a dead religion from its forgotten grave, and to make it tell its story, would require an enchanter's wand. Other old faiths of Egypt, Babylon, Greece, Rome are known to us, but in their case, liturgies, myths, theogonies, theologies, and the accessories of cult remain to yield their report of an outward form of human belief and inspiration. How scanty, on the other hand, are the records of the Celtic religion, the bygone faith of a people who have inspired the world with noble dreams must be constructed painfully, and often in fear and trembling, out of fragmentary, and in many cases, transformed remains. We have the surface observations of classical observers, dedications in the Romano-Celtic area to gods mostly assimilated to the gods of the conquerors, figured monuments mainly of the same period, coins, symbols, place and personal names. For the Irish Celts, there is a mass of written material, mainly found in the 11th and 12th century manuscripts. Much of this, in spite of alteration and excision, is based on divine and heroic myth, and it also contains occasional notice of ritual. From Wales come documents like the Mabinogion, and strange poems, the personages of which are ancient gods transformed, but which tell nothing of rite or cult. Valuable hints are furnished by early ecclesiastical documents, but more important is existing folk custom, which preserves so much of the old cult, though it has lost its meaning to those who now use it. Folk tales may also be inquired of, if we discriminate between what in them is Celtic and what is universal. Lastly, Celtic burial mounds and other remains yield their testimony to ancient belief and custom. From these sources we try to rebuild Celtic paganism and to guess at its inner spirit, though we are working in the twilight on a heap of fragments. No Celt has left us a record of his faith and practice, and the unwritten poems of the Druid died with them. Yet with these fragments we see the Celt as the seeker after God, linking himself by strong ties to the unseen, and eager to conquer the unknown by religious rite or magic art. For the things of the spirit have never appealed in vain to the Celtic soul, and long ago classical observers were struck with the religiosity of the Celts. They neither forgot nor transgressed the law of the gods, and they thought that no good befell men apart from their will. The submission of the Celts to the Druids shows how they welcomed authority in matters of religion, and all Celtic regions have been characterized by religious devotion, easily passing over it to superstition, and by loyalty to ideals and lost causes. The Celts were born dreamers, as their exquisite Elysium belief will show, and much that is spiritual and romantic in more than one European literature is due to them. The analogy of religious evolution in other faiths helps us in reconstructing that of the Celts. Though no historic Celtic group was racially pure, the profound influence of the Celtic temperament soon Celticized the religious contributions of the non-Celtic element, which may already have had Celtic parallels. Because a given Celtic rite or belief seems to be un-Aryan, it need not necessarily be borrowed. The Celts had a savage past, and, conservative as they were, they kept much of it alive. Our business, therefore, lies with Celtic religion as a whole. These primitive elements were there before the Celts migrated from the old Aryan home. Yet, since they appear in Celtic religion to the end, we speak of them as Celtic. The earliest aspect of that religion, before the Celts became a separate people, was a cult of nature spirits, or of the life manifested in nature. But men and women probably had separate cults, and of the two, perhaps that of the latter was more important. As hunters, men worshipped the animals they slew, apologizing to them for the slaughter. This apologetic attitude, found with all primitive hunters, is of the nature of a cult. Other animals, too sacred to be slain, would be preserved and worshipped, the cult giving rise to domestication and pastoral life, with totemism as a probable factor. Earth, producing vegetation, was the fruitful mother. But since the origin of agriculture is mainly due to women, the earth cult would be practiced by them, as well as, later, that of vegetation and corn spirits, all regarded as female. As men began to interest themselves in agriculture, they would join in the female cults, probably with the result of changing the sex of the spirits worshipped. An earth god would take the place of the earth mother, or stand in as her consort or son. Vegetation and corn spirits would often become male, though many spirits, even when they were exalted into divinities, remained female. With the growth of religion, the vaguer spirits tended to become gods and goddesses, and worshipful animals to become anthropomorphic divinities, with the animals as their symbols, attendants, or victims. And as the cult of vegetation spirits centered in the ritual of planting and sowing, so the cult of divinities of growth centered in the great seasonal and agricultural festivals, in which the key to the growth of Celtic religion is to be found. But the migrating Celts, conquering new lands, evolved divinities of war, and here the old female influence is still at work, since many of these are female. In spite of possessing so many local war gods, the Celts were not merely men of war. Even the equites engaged in war only when occasion rose, and agriculture as well as pastoral industry was constantly practiced both in Gaul and Britain before the conquest. In Ireland, the belief in the dependence of fruitfulness upon the king shows to what extent agriculture flourished there. Music, poetry, crafts, and trade gave rise to cultured divinities, perhaps evolved from gods of growth, since later myths attributed to them both the origin of arts and crafts and the introduction of domestic animals among men. Culture goddesses still held their place among culture gods and were regarded as their mothers. The prominence of these divinities shows that the Celts were more than a race of warriors. The pantheon was thus a large one, but on the whole the divinities of growth were more generally important. The older nature spirits and divine animals were never quite forgotten, especially by the folk who preserved the old rituals of vegetation spirits, while the gods of growth were worshipped at the great festivals. Yet, in essence, the lower and the higher cults were one and the same. And, save where Roman influence destroyed Celtic religion, the older primitive strands are everywhere apparent. The temperament of the Celt kept him close to nature, and he never quite dropped the primitive elements of his religion. Moreover, the early influence of female cults of female spirits and goddesses remained to the end as another predominant factor. Most of the Celtic divinities were local in character, each tribe possessing its own group, each god having functions similar to those of other groups. Some, however, had or gained a more universal character, absorbing divinities with similar functions. Still, this local character must be borne in mind. The numerous divinities of Gaul, with differing names, but, judging by their assimilation to the same Roman divinity, similar functions, are best understood as gods of local groups. This is probably true also of Britain and Ireland. But those gods worshipped far and wide over the Celtic area may be gods of the undivided Celts, or gods of some dominant Celtic group extending their influence on all sides, or, in some cases, popular gods whose cult passed beyond the tribal bounds. If it seemed precarious to see such a close similarity in the local gods of a people extending right across Europe, appeal can be made to the influence of the Celtic temperament, producing everywhere the same results, and to the homogeneity of Celtic civilization, save in local areas, example, the south of Gaul. Moreover, the comparison of the various testimonies of onlookers points to a general similarity, while the permanence of the primitive elements in Celtic religion must have tended to keep it everywhere the same. Though in Gaul we have only inscriptions, and in Ireland only distorted myths, yet those testimonies, as well as the evidence of folk survivals in both regions, point to the similarity of religious phenomenon. The Druids, as a more or less organized priesthood, would assist in preserving the general likeness. Thus, the primitive nature spirits gave place to greater or lesser gods, each with his separate department and functions. Though growing civilization tended to separate them from the soil, they never quite lost touch with it. In return for man's worship and sacrifices, they gave life and increase, victory, strength, and skill. But these sacrifices had been and still often were rites in which the representative of a god was slain. Some divinities were worshipped over a wide area. Most were gods of local groups, and there were spirits of every place, hill, wood, and stream. Magic rites mingled with the cult, but both were guided by an organized priesthood. And as the Celts believed in unseen gods, so they believed in an unseen region whither they passed after death. Our knowledge of the higher side of Celtic religion is practically a blank, since no description of the inner spiritual life has come down to us. How far the Celts cultivated religion in our sense of the term, or had glimpses of monotheism, or were troubled by a deep sense of sin, is unknown. But a people whose spiritual influence has later been so great must have had glimpses of these things. Some of them must have known the thirst of the soul for God, or sought a higher ethical standard than that of their time. The enthusiastic reception of Christianity, the devotion of the early Celtic saints, and the character of the old Celtic Church all suggest this. The relation of the Celtic Church to paganism was mainly intolerant, though not wholly so. It often adopted the less harmful customs of the past, merging pagan festivals in its own, founding churches on the sites of the old cult, dedicating sacred wells to a saint. A saint would visit the tomb of a pagan to hear an old epic rehearsed, or would call up pagan heroes from hell and give them a place in paradise. Other saints recalled dead heroes from the land of the blessed and learned the nature of that wonderland and the heroic deeds. Quote, "Of the old days which seem to be much older than any history that is written in any book." Unquote. Reading such narratives, we gain a lesson in the fine spirit of Christian tolerance and Christian sympathy. Chapter 2. The Celtic People. Scrutiny reveals the fact that Celtic-speaking people are of differing types, short and dark, as well as tall and fairer Highlanders or Welshmen, short, broad-headed Bretons, various types of Irishmen. Men with Norse names and a Norse aspect, quote, have the Gaelic, unquote. But all alike have the same character and temperament, a striking witness to the influence which the character as well as the language of the Celts, whoever they were, made on all with whom they mingled. Ethnologically, there may not have been a Celtic race, but something was handed down from the days of comparative Celtic purity, which welded different social elements onto a common type, found often where no Celtic tongue is now spoken. It emerges where we least expect it, and the stolid Anglo-Saxon may suddenly awaken to something in himself due to a forgotten Celtic strain in his ancestry. Two main theories of Celtic origins now hold the field. 1. The Celts are identified with the progenitors of the short, brachycephalic alpine race of Central Europe, existing there in Neolithic times after their migrations from Africa and Asia. The type is found among the Slavs, in parts of Germany and Scandinavia, and in modern France in the region of Caesar's Celtae, among the Auvergnats, the Bretons, and in Lozère and Jura. Representatives of the type have been found in Belgian and French Neolithic graves. Professor Sergi calls this the Eurasiatic race, and, contrary to general opinion, identifies it with the Aryans, a savage people, inferior to the Dolichocephalic Mediterranean race, whose language they Aryanized. Professor Keene thinks that they were themselves an Aryanized folk before reaching Europe, who in turn gave their acquired Celtic and Slavic speech to the preceding masses. Later came the Belgae, Aryans who acquired the Celtic speech of the people they conquered. Broca assumed that the dark brachycephalic people, whom he identified with Caesar's Celtae, differed from the Belgae, were conquered by them, and acquired the language of their conquerors, hence wrongly called Celtic by philologists. The Belgae were tall and fair, and overran Gaul, except Aquitaine, mixing generally with the Celtae, who in Caesar's time had thus an infusion of Belgic blood. But before this conquest, the Celtae had already mingled with the aboriginal Dolichocephalic folk of Gaul, Iberians, or Mediterraneans of Professor Sergi. The latter had apparently remained comparatively pure from admixture in Aquitaine, and are probably the Aquitani of Caesar. But were the short brachycephalic folk Celts? Caesar says the people who call themselves Celtae were called Gauls by the Romans, and Gauls, according to classical writers, were tall and fair. Hence, the Celtae were not a short, dark race, and Caesar himself says that Gauls, including Celtae, looked with contempt on the short Romans. Strabo also says that Celtae and Belgae had the same Gaulish appearance, i.e. tall and fair. Caesar's statement that Aquitani, Galli, and Belgae differ in language, institutions, and laws is vague and unsupported by evidence, and may mean as to language no more than a difference in dialects. This is also suggested by Strabo's words, Celtae and Belgae, quote, differ a little, unquote, in language. No classical writer describes the Celts as short and dark, but the reverse. Short, dark people would have been called Iberians without respect to skulls. Classical observers were not craniologists. The short brachycephalic type is now prominent in France because it has always been so, eliminating the tall, fair Celtic type. Conquering Celts, fewer in number than the broad, narrow-headed Aborigines, intermarried or made less lasting alliances with them. In course of time, the type of the more numerous race was bound to prevail. Even in Caesar's day, the latter probably outnumbered the tall and fair Celts, who had, however, Celticized them. But classical writers, who knew the true Celt as tall and fair, saw that type only, just as everyone, on first visiting France or Germany, sees this generalized type of Frenchman or German everywhere. Later, he modifies his opinion. But this the classical observers did not do. Caesar's campaigns must have drained Gaul of many tall and fair Celts. This, with the tendency of dark types to outnumber fair types in South and Central Europe, may help to explain the growing prominence of the dark type, though the tall, fair type is far from uncommon. 2. The second theory, already anticipated, sees in Gauls and Belgae a tall, fair Celtic folk, speaking a Celtic language and belonging to the race which stretched from Ireland to Asia Minor, from North Germany to the Po, and were masters of Teutonic tribes until they were driven by them from the region between the Elbe and the Rhine. Some Belgic tribes claimed a Germanic ancestry, but German was a word seldom used with precision, and in this case may not mean Teutonic. The fair hair of this people has made many suppose that they were akin to the Teutons. But fairness is relative, and the dark Romans may have called brown hair fair, while they occasionally distinguished between the fair Gauls and even fairer Germans. Their institutions and their religions differed, and though they were so long in contact, the names of their gods and priests are unalike. Their languages, again, though of Aryan stock, differ more from each other than does Celtic from Italic, pointing to a long period of Italo-Celtic unity before Italiotes and Celts separated, and Celts came in contact with Teutons. The typical German differs in mental and moral qualities from the typical Celt. Contrast an East Country Scot, descendant of Teutonic stock, with a West Highlander, and the difference leaps to the eyes. Celts and Germans of history differ, then, in relative fairness, character, religion, and language. The tall, blonde Teutonic type of the Rhograves is dolichocephalic. Was the Celtic type, assuming that Broca's Celts were not true Celts, dolicho or brachy? Broca thinks the Belgae, or Cymri, were dolichocephalic, but all must agree with him that the skulls are too few to generalize from. Celtic Iron Age skulls in Britain are dolichocephalic, perhaps a recrudescence of the aboriginal type. Broca's Cymric skulls are mesocephalic. This he attributes to crossing with the short roundheads. The evidence is too scanty for generalization. While the Walloons, perhaps descendants of the Belgae, have a high index, and some Gauls of classical art are broad-headed. Skulls of the British round barrows, early Celtic Bronze Age, are mostly broad, the best specimens showing affinity to Neolithic brachycephalic skulls from Grinnell, though their owners were 5 inches shorter, Celino and Borreby. Dr. Badeau thinks that the narrow-skulled Belgae on the whole reinforced the meso- or brachycephalic round-barrow folk in Britain. Dr. Thurman identifies the latter with the Belgae, Broca's Cymri, and thinks that Gaulish skulls were round, with beetling brows. Professors Ripley and Sergey, disregarding their difference in stature and higher cephalic index, identify them with the short Alpine race, Broca's Celts. This is negatived by Mr. Keene. Might not both, however, have originally sprung from a common stock and reached Europe at different times? But do a few hundred skulls justify these far-reaching conclusions regarding races enduring for thousands of years? At some very remote period, there may have been a Celtic type, as at some further period there may have been an Aryan type. But the Celts as we know them must have mingled with the aborigines of Europe and become a mixed race, though preserving and endowing others with their racial and mental characteristics. Some Gauls or Belgae were dolichocephalic, to judge by their skulls. Others were brachycephalic, while their fairness was a relative term. Classical observers probably generalized from the higher classes of a purer type. They tell us nothing of the people. But the higher classes may have had varying skulls, as well as stature and color of hair, and Irish texts tell of a tall, fair, blue-eyed stock and a short, dark-eyed stock in Ireland. Even in those distant ages, we must consider the people on whom the Celts impressed their characteristics, as well as the Celts themselves. What happened on the Eurasian steppe, the hypothetical cradle of the Aryans, whence the Celts came stepping westwards, seems clear to some, but in truth is a book sealed with 7 seals. The men whose Aryan speech was to dominate far and wide may already have possessed different types of skull, and that age was far from the very beginning. Thus the Celts, before setting out on their Wanderjahre, may already have been a mixed race, even if their leaders were of purer stock. But they had the bond of common speech, institutions, and religion, and they formed a common Celtic type in Central and Western Europe. Intermarriage with the already mixed Neolithic folk of Central Europe produced further removal from the unmixed Celtic racial type. But though both reacted on each other as far as language, custom, and belief were concerned, on the whole, these Celtic elements predominated in these respects. The Celtic migration into Gaul produced further racial mingling with descendants of the old Paleolithic stock, Dolichocephalic Iberians and Ligurians, and brachycephalic swarthy folk, Broca's Celts. Thus, even the first Celtic arrivals in Britain, the Goidels, were people of a mixed race, though probably relatively purer than the late-coming Brythons, the latest of whom had probably mingled with the Teutons. Hence, among Celtic-speaking folk or their descendants, short, dark, broad-headed Bretons, tall, fair or rufous Highlanders, tall, chestnut-haired Welshmen or Irishmen, Highlanders of Norse descent, short, dark, narrow-headed Highlanders, Irishmen and Welshmen, there is a common Celtic facies, the result of old Celtic characteristics powerful enough so to impress themselves on such varied peoples, in spite of what they gave to the Celtic incomers. These peoples became Celtic, and Celtic in speech and character they have remained, even where ancestral physical types are reasserting themselves. The folk of a Celtic type, whether pre-Celtic, Celtic, or Norse, have all spoken a Celtic language and exhibit the same old Celtic characteristics: vanity, loquacity, excitability, fickleness, imagination, love of the romantic, fidelity, attachment to family ties, sentimental love of their country, religiosity passing over easily to superstition, and a comparatively high degree of sexual morality. Some of these traits were already noted by classical observers. The theory of an early Goidelic occupation of Britain has been contested by Professor Meyer, who holds that the first Goidels reached Britain from Ireland in the 2nd century, while Dr. McBain was of the opinion that England, apart from Wales and Cornwall, knew no Goidels, the place names being Brythonic. But unless all Goidels reached Ireland from Gaul or Spain, as some did, Britain was more easily reached than Ireland by migrating Goidels from the continent. Whether or not all the Pictish invaders of Britain were called Pictavi, this word, or Picti, perhaps from Quicto, from the Irish meaning engraver, became a general name for this people. Hence, Pictavi, or Pictones, the tattooed men, those who engraved figures on their bodies, as the Picts certainly did. Dispossessed and driven north by incoming Brythons and Belgae, they later became the virulent enemies of Rome. In 306, Eumenius describes all the northern tribes as Caledoni and other Picts, while some of the tribes mentioned by Ptolemy have Brythonic names or names with Gaulish cognates. Place names in the Pictish area, personal names in the Pictish Chronicle, and Pictish names like Pianfahel have Brythonic affinities. If the Picts spoke a Brythonic dialect, St. Columba's need of an interpreter when preaching to them would be explained. Later, the Picts were conquered by the Irish Goidels, the Scoti. The Picts, however, must already have mingled with the aboriginal peoples and with the Goidels, if these were already in Britain, and they may have adopted their supposed non-Aryan customs from the Aborigines. On the other hand, the matriarchate seems at one time to have been Celtic, and it may have been no more than a conservative survival in the Pictish royal house, as it was elsewhere. Britons as well as Caledonii had wives in common. As to tattooing, it was practiced by the Scoti, the scarred and painted men, and the Britons dyed themselves with woad, while what seem to be tattoo marks appear on the faces of Gaulish coins. Tattooing, painting, and scarifying the body are varieties of one general custom, and little stress can be laid on Pictish tattooing as indicating a racial difference. Its purpose may have been ornamental, or possibly to impart an aspect of fierceness, or the figures may have been totem marks, as they are elsewhere. Finally, the description of the Caledonii, a Pictish people possessing flaming hair and mighty limbs, shows that they differed from the short, dark, pre-Celtic folk. The Pictish problem must remain obscure, a welcome puzzle to antiquaries, philologists, and ethnologists. Our knowledge of Pictish religion is too scanty for the interpretation of Celtic religion to be affected by it, but we know that the Picts offered sacrifice before war, a Celtic custom, and had Druids, as also had the Celts. The earliest Celtic kingdom was in the region between the upper waters of the Rhine, the Elbe, and the Danube, where probably in Neolithic times the formation of their Celtic speech as a distinctive language began. Here they first became known to the Greeks, probably as a semi-mythical people, the Hyperboreans, the folk dwelling beyond the Ripoian mountains whence Boreas blew, with whom Hecatius in the 4th century identifies them. But they were now known as Celts, and their territory as Celtica, while Galatas was used as a synonym of Celtae in the 3rd century BC. The name generally applied by the Romans to the Celts was Galli, a term finally confirmed by them to the people of Gaul. Successive bands of Celts went forth from this comparatively restricted territory until the Celtic Empire for some centuries before 300 BC included the British Isles, parts of the Iberian Peninsula, Gaul, northern Italy, Belgium, Holland, great part of Germany, and Austria. When the German tribes revolted, Celtic bands appeared in Asia Minor and remained there as the Galatian Celts. Archaeological discoveries with the Celtic fasces have been made in part of these lands, but even more striking is the witness of place names. Celtic Dunnen, a fort or castle, the Gaelic Dun, is found in compound names from Ireland to southern Russia. Magos, a field, is met with in Britain, France, Switzerland, Prussia, Italy, and Austria. River and mountain names familiar in Britain occur on the continent. The Pennine range of Cumberland has the same name as the Apennines. Rivers named for their inherent divinity, Davos, are found in Britain and on the continent, Dee, Deva, etc. Besides this linguistic, had the Celts also a political unity over their great empire under one head? Such a unity certainly did not prevail from Ireland to the Balkan Peninsula, but it prevailed over a large part of the Celtic area. Livy, following Timagenes, who perhaps cited a lost Celtic epos, speaks of a king Abacatus ruling over the Celts from Spain to Germany, and sending his sister's sons Bellovesus and Segovesus with many followers to found new colonies in Italy and the Hercynian forest. Mythical as this may be, it suggests the hegemony of one tribe or one chief over other tribes and chiefs. For Livy says that the sovereign power rested with the Bituriges, who appointed the king of Celticum, viz. Abacatus. Some such unity is necessary to explain Celtic power in the ancient world, and it was made possible by unity of race, or at least of the congeries of Celticized people, by religious solidarity, and probably by regular gatherings of all the kings or chiefs. If the Druids were a Celtic priesthood at this time, or already formed a corporation as they did later in Gaul, they must have endeavored to form and preserve such a unity. And if it was never so compact as Livy's words suggest, it must have been regarded as an ideal by the Celts or by their poets, Abacatus serving as a central figure round which the ideas of empire crystallized. The hegemony existed in Gaul, where the Arverni and their king claimed power over other tribes, and where the Romans tried to weaken the Celtic unity by opposing to them the Aedni. In Belgium, the hegemony was in the hands of the Suessiones, to whose king Belgic tribes in Britain submitted. In Ireland, the High King was supreme over other smaller kings, and in Galatia, the unity of the tribes was preserved by a council with regular assemblies. The diffusion of the Ambicatus legend would help to preserve unity by recalling the mythic greatness of the past. The Boii and Insubri appealed to Transalpine Gauls for aid by reminding them of the deeds of their ancestors. Nor would the Druids omit to infuse into their pupils' minds the sentiment of national greatness. For this and for other reasons, the Romans, to whom the sovereignty of all Gaul was an obnoxious watchword, endeavored to suppress them. But the Celts were too widely scattered ever to form a compact empire. The Roman Empire extended itself gradually in the consciousness of its power. The cohesion of the Celts in an empire or under one king was made impossible by their migrations and diffusion. Their unity, such as it was broken by the revolt of the Teutonic tribes, and their subjugation was completed by Rome. The dreams of wide empire remained dreams, for the Celts, in spite of their vigor, have been a race of dreamers, and their conquests in latter times, those of the spirit rather than of the mailed fist. Their superiority has consisted in imparting to others their characteristics. Organized unity and vast empire could never be theirs.